Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our, I think the second of our virtual town hall meetings for the school. And this time I'm here to talk to you about the release of the Engaged Classroom plan, or at least the beta version. And if you're familiar with software releases, the beta version is the version that's full of bugs and has most of its functions there, but is not quite ready for final release. So this is a model that I've been working on with a colleague for quite a few months now. We've been looking at what's good practice around the learning and teaching world, and we've then developed a model which we hope is a scaffold that we can build good practice on. So this isn't designed from the outset to be a prescriptive model. It's designed to be something which gets people talking and gets people developing and building their own models. And I'll come back to more of that in a second. So a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't used Zoom before, there is a button down the bottom that says chat. And if you use that, it'll bring up a chat window where you can post comments, and it's a very effective way to open a second channel of discussion. You can also, of course, I'm not sure which button it is because I've got the discussion leader button here at the moment, but there should be a button on your screen to raise your hand if you want me to actually hand the microphone over to you to ask a question. You can do that as well. So with large groups, it can be kind of difficult, and we all have the difficulty. We all know how hard it is to actually communicate using Jabber. Zoom gives us a couple of little extra tools that'll help us communicate. Anyway, enough of that. So my intention today, I guess, is to give you a quick rundown on the project. I don't want to spend a long time on it. And then provide an opportunity for people to ask questions and get the discussion started. So the background of this, the background of the plan was Lee asked me when I first started working here, was it only August? I think it was only August, asked me to have a look at the flipped classroom models that were very popular amongst business schools at the time.
Here I am.
Yay!
Sorry.
That was an exciting fanfare.
Yeah. Sorry?
I mention his name and he appears. Anyway.
I was trying to work out how this worked, because normally you get a link saying hit on this thing.
Yes. It should have been.
Get a link. But anyway, I worked it out. It's okay.
It should have been Outlook. Anyway. Lee asked me to have a look at the flipped classroom model, which a lot of people have been having a lot of success with. A lot of people haven't been. And part of the problem is there's no real definition about what the flipped classroom is. And there's some really good practice and some really bad practice. So what we did was we made the decision to label it the engaged classroom, so it's our own model. It also connects rather nicely to the CQ engagement agenda. So it fits there fairly nicely. But it's also, I guess, I want to flag that it's a composite of a lot of different ideas. It's not one distinct thing, and I don't want it to be like the flipped classroom where some people are seen as getting on the bandwagon or something that's new and trendy. This is actually building on practice that goes back years and years and years of good teaching practice. So we've taken some of the good bits out of the flipped classroom model, and we've abandoned others that we were more critical of. So there's basically going to be 3 documents that we're producing. And these are in draft form at the moment. You have 2 of them. One is the roadmap, which is just the general overview. It doesn't, as you'll notice, have references in there because the kind of document that it is, we didn't want to weigh it down with the bulk of all the research. Because of that, Caroline and I are actually producing a second document, which is not in proper draft form yet, which is an academic article on our process and what we've built this out of. So if you're interested in following up the links in the academic research, that's coming. That'll be a separate document to make sure that this one is kept as readable as possible. The second document that you also have is a Moodle design guide, which is a breakdown of some of the basic elements we see Moodle sites needing to have. And it's don't be too overwhelmed by it, because it's got lots and lots of tips, hints and ideas in there. So it's the one that's a grid, and if you first look at it, it might look like there's heaps and heaps of material in there. Most of that's advisory, most of that is for your interest and to provide you with ideas, rather than saying you have to do all these things. And I guess that's one of the fundamental issues around releasing a plan like this, is we don't want it to be prescriptive. The problem with prescriptive is that it very quickly turns into a compliance exercise, where some folks will sort of say, what is the bare minimum I need to do to actually comply with this? And then we've basically lost the opportunity to have a conversation around it. So it's designed to be something for you to build on, to contribute to. Before the final version goes out, there'll be plenty of chance to give feedback and to time or and to evolve this a little more. But at the other extreme, it does have at some level a prescriptive role, in that most people are doing well. Most people are developing materials, they're putting stuff out there, and it's great. But there are some Moodle sites out there that are quite disgraceful. And those are the ones that we need to work, particularly in peer review, and this is where the discipline groups are going to be very important, to actually identify some of those things and to set some standards for people and say, these are the sort of things we expect to see. So there are sites out there that have nothing but a set of publisher slides, or they have a set of recorded lectures from Monash. Those sorts of things we can't have. And that's the level at which this does become a compliance-driven document. We are going to have some point be able to set standards to say, these are the minimum things we think you need to include. But again, the risk of that is that people end up saying, well, okay, I'll just hit those notes and I won't, you know, or it'll be seen as something that is, an overly prescriptive format, and it will inhibit people from being creative or from doing interesting things. We don't want any of those things, but I think the bad practice that's around, as Justice Potter Stewart said about pornography, that I can't define what it is, but I know it when I see it. Bad practice is like that. We all know it when we see it. It's very embarrassing to all of us, and it's something we need to take care of in-house. And we don't really, I don't think it's the right approach to have the curriculum police and to go in there course by course and to chase people up. But I think through peer review, that's where we'll start to develop good practice. And that's where we'll start to sort of cast a little bit of sunlight on some of the darker parts of our Moodle sites where people have been getting away with not putting very much there. That being said, that is not the primary objective of this model. This model is not primarily about chasing out bad practice. What it is about identifying good practice and providing resources for people to build on that. All right, so there's the 3 documents at the moment in draft form. I'll just quickly talk through some of the things that are in there before I hand over for questions and discussion. We start out with some of the design principles that inform the way we've created the model. And that's really all about active learning and problem-solving learning. And we don't want to get too much on, you know, what's problem-solving, what's problem-based learning, or any of those sorts of things. But what we're looking at is a move from passive to active learning. We're moving from a mid-20th century model, which was all about massification. It was about getting as many bums on seats as possible and having huge lecture theatres and huge lectures, to the 21st century models, which are all about keeping and engaging students. Because when it comes to a massified model, when it comes to creating big generic courses, the private providers are on our doorstep. Pearson University will be here 5 years, probably at most, and they will be able to provide mass online education at a cost that we can't compete with. So what we've got to look at is, what is it about the student experience that will ask students, someone's got an open mic somewhere, what is it about our particular experience that will bring students to us, that will say, okay, I could spend half the money and I could get a tick and flip degree from Pearson University, or answer some multiple choice tests and do some online readings. What is it about this EQU that's going to be different? Why am I willing to pay more and expend more energy on this kind of degree? So the design principles, there's 5 of them there, but they really are largely around that active orientation and about making the most of classroom time. So rather than, this is the one thing that the best thing we've taken from the classroom is that we have a very small window of opportunity to work with students. We have a few hours a week that we have face-to-face contact with them, or online for our online courses. We don't want to waste that time by delivering passive lectures where students are just sitting there doing Facebook or checking their messages through the whole thing. That's a waste of an opportunity. So what we do is, if we look at refocusing our efforts around delivery of content, think very seriously about what content we do need to deliver, and then we find the best way to deliver that. But we try and make the most of that face-to-face time. Because if students are just sitting there doing Facebook, there's no wonder they're not turning up, because they can do Facebook anyway. And if we're recording those lectures, they can say, well, I can always view them at any time anyway, and we lose a real opportunity. Anyway, so there's a bit in the plan about why the foundations, the background of why we're moving that way. And a lot of that is about the changes of the sector and the changes of learners of themselves, that neurologists are actually studying the different ways that millennials' brains operate. They actually operate differently because they were brought up with the internet and brought up with content which is always there. So our old massified models of, I mean, I don't want to turn this into too much of a sort of preaching to the converted, but our old massified models of learning were based on a time when knowledge was scarce. That we had a narrow sort of 3-year time period where we had access to students, and we had to cram as much knowledge into their heads as possible, because once they walked outside our doors, they lost access to all that knowledge. Well, the internet has changed all of that, and learners' brains have changed along with it. And part of that is this idea of just-in-time learning. So the idea of saying, learn this now because later on you'll need to know it, just doesn't work with people whose brains are wired that way, because they know they can always go looking for information just in time. So part of this plan is thinking about how do we respond to learners who actually think quite differently to the learners of the past. Learners who we can't say, sit in here and listen to a 2-hour lecture because in 10 weeks' time you're going to have an exam and some of this might be on the exam. That just doesn't make sense to people whose brains are wired around the internet. So all that's part of it. And part of it, again, this gets back to being active and engaged in the classroom. So there's a guide there in terms of some of the core parts of implementation. One is looking at study guides and what we put in the study guides, and in some ways beefing up what we do in that space. So rather than, and one of the things I was told very early on in my career by Paul Ramsden was, don't work harder, work smarter. And a lot of changes, when you say to people, we need to change our practice, they'll say, I'm already working so hard, I'm already doing so much, how can I do more? Well, the question is to redirect some of those efforts. So if we're sitting in front of empty classrooms for 6 hours a week, for 8 hours a week, delivering lectures that no one's listening to, let's spend that time and all that energy doing something else. Let's spend that creating self-paced material, study guides and things that students hopefully will engage with. So that's one of the implementation aspects. Another is focus on looking at key concepts. So breaking courses down into key elements and key activities that we can develop resources around, and hopefully in time share with other people. Open education is on the move. Open education is building momentum all the time. And if we start creating good resources, we only have to create some of them, because then we can share them with other people. The third is the use of media to engage the community, and a bit of that involves some PD around what's good and what's not, how to use media effectively. And the fourth is a focus on assessment. There's no point in building a wonderful, engaging, creative environment and then having a huge didactic exam at the end. We need this, and I'm not saying we can't have exams, but what I'm saying is that our assessment needs to follow what we're doing in those learning spaces. The purpose of learning is not to complete an exam. The purpose of any assessment should be to supplement and complement that learning and to evaluate that learning. All right, I'm sounding very preachy, I'm sure. So pulling back to the practical aspects, there's a little discussion in there about how the model works at different scales. So it needs to be scalable, it needs to work at the top program level, we need to be thinking about it, but also at the design of a unit of study level, at the design of weekly workshops, and on the design of every individual activity. So it has to work all the way down and all the way up again, and I guess all the way across. So we need to make sure this is a coherent experience for students. And that again, that's something that's very difficult to do in a compliance-driven way. But as we evolve as a community, it's something that that will just be part of what the students' experience is. There's a certain way of thinking that is dangerous, and a lot of that, I think, it's dangerous because it comes from people thinking they're doing the best thing for the students. And that is the way of thinking of saying, look, my job is to get the students through the course and to be able to provide them with as much support, resources, and whatever is possible, just so they can get through. Now, the problem with, and I'm sure people are doing that for what they think is the right reasons. The problem is it creates this minimal compliance environment for the students as well, where they're not taking responsibility for learning, where they're just seeing each obstacle, each unit of study as an obstacle to get through, and to get through is the most effective way with the minimum amount of effort. And if students get used to that in first semester, we've lost them for the rest of the time. And as I said, this is dangerous because a lot of people do it. A lot of people don't even think about what they're doing, and they think they're doing the right thing by the students. And students love it because, well, they don't at first. They get a bit disillusioned. They go, I'm going to uni. I thought it'd be a bit different. I thought it'd be a bit more exciting. But very quickly, it's easy to get into that. Well, okay, what's the minimum I have to do? And let's set our sights higher than that, and let's start engaging students right from the very beginning. All right. Another part of it is what we're calling the 360-degree view of study. So that is thinking about before, during, and after on everything we do. I won't go through that in too much detail now, but I think we think very much in a single direction very often. And what the Engaged Classroom Plan is about, thinking about the whole learning process. What happens before, what happens in classroom, and the one we usually don't even think about is what happens afterwards. How do we measure? How do we get feedback? How do we give students feedback on their process, and how do we get feedback from them in terms of their needs and what we do? There's a page in there on delivery models. That's an open question at the moment, and that involves a lot of managerial issues as well. But as I said, when I talked about learning, working smarter rather than harder, at some point we need to figure out what this does for our delivery models. We can't just everyone take unilateral action and say, that's it, I'm flipping my classroom, all the lectures are online, and I'm only going to do a 1 hour tutor a week. We can't do that kind of thing. But as an organisation, we need to think about, are our current models sufficient? Are, for instance, delivering lectures on multiple sites to different groups of students, is that actually useful, or is that just confusing everyone? Would it be better to actually move some of that labour towards providing online lectures and online support, and then providing more support on site? So this document doesn't provide an answer. It's not like some of the flipped classroom models that says, well, hey, we're all basically learning online now. So, but what it does say is we need to have that conversation, and we need to be clear about the way in which we are using that face-to-face time. And we're not, unique in that. All universities are facing that issue. They're facing empty classrooms. They're facing even present absenteeism, where students are physically there, but are mentally somewhere else in the classroom. That costs a lot of money. As soon as we bring sessionals in, that starts costing a huge amount of money. When there are assessment implications, it costs even more money. Is there a way we can actually redeploy those resources in a way that doesn't breach the EB, doesn't mean that people are working more hours for no reward, but also is a more sensible way of working on our resources. That's an open discussion on that page, and it's not something I have an end solution to, but it's something we do need to think about as an organisation. And the last page basically has some overall tips and hints and things that just didn't fit anywhere else in the document. So that's, I know, been 20 minutes of me yakking at you, but hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea of the intention behind the plan. The next stage, I think, like all beta plans, is to get some folks working with it, designing with it, using it, working out the kinks in it. Again, not a compliance document. You're not going to have to go away for term 2 and make sure that every Moodle unit you has key concepts and has this and has that. However, if you do use it as part of your course development, that will actually provide valuable feedback for us to actually think about where we're going with the next stage, with the next draft. Now, in terms of feedback, we've got some time now for discussion. This recording will be, and just to remind everyone, it is being recorded in case you're nervous about that. This recording will be posted on our blog, cqubusiness.blogspot.com, and there will be space there. The documents are also posted there. There'll be space there for people to give feedback as well. And if you want to give private individual feedback directly to myself, that's another option as well. So there's lots of opportunities to give feedback. And hopefully through term 2, we'll have a better idea of how we evolve it. So questions, we've got the chat window that you can ask questions in. You can raise your hand if you'd like to raise your hand, and I'll hand the microphone over to you, or you can just start shouting all at once if you want to.
Can I go first?
Yeah.
Sorry if I missed some of it. I think everything you've said obviously makes sense, but I think one of the bits that we haven't paid attention to is actually preparing the students. So students need to also be prepared in terms of how to engage with the engaged classroom. So do we attack that bit as well?
What do other people think?
Well, Scott and Lee, I think we should be training students right from the start in the first year courses to get them used to the behaviours we expect, instead of allowing them to just evolve their own learning practices. We should be training them to be university students.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think it's just that it's too simple to say, we're ready, we've designed it. They've got to know how to work with this, because I think someone else was saying that there's an expectation of what university is. I keep giving the same example that Monash and Western Sydney gave us recently, but they're actually saying that if you want them to do something, there's got to be assessment, there's got to be grades associated with it. They're not going to watch a video because we think it's exciting, or watch a video because there's some questions we're going to, use, and they get assessed for it. So we've got to link assessment to the classroom, to the engaged classroom. Happy for other views.
No, definitely. I mean, sorry.
Ross first.
Unmute.
Right. I just posted a question up there, Scott, about the way the MBA is changing in terms of delivery models. So we're looking at moving to intensive blocks for many MBA courses rather than week by week. And this is going to force some changes on how the actual structure of the courses are being presented and delivered. How does your engaged classroom fit with those sort of changed delivery models?
Hopefully it's completely consistent with it, because we're focusing on what it is that students do rather than the delivery itself. So if we figure out what we want students to be able to do, we figure out what we want them to do in the classroom to practice those things they need to be able to do, then we actually use our delivery, whether it be a face-to-face classroom or a virtual classroom or self-paced activities, to actually focus on achieving those things. So we start with, rather than the student experience being the result of a whole lot of other things, and at the end of the day, they get this experience by default, we actually look at what we want the experience to be up front, I think. And that may well involve, burst mode. It may involve intensives. Certainly one of the things we're starting to get from school level students is that they're disengaged. And this is not just, a CQU problem. Monash and Melbourne have huge empty classrooms with someone at the front talking for 2 hours, and the students saying, well, I'll pick it up later. I'll download the recorded lectures. And of course, we have a fairly good idea from download rates that most students don't ever do that either. So yeah, we need to sort of really focus on what we want them to do in the classroom. And as Lee said before, assessment is the engine that drives engagement. And we need to think about, how do we design assessment that first of all captures all of that? It incentivises students, and probably equally importantly, that doesn't drive us crazy, that doesn't end up in a situation where all we do every week is just sit there micro-grading micro-assessment items.
I'd like to comment. I'm finding the challenge from where I sit at the moment is just holding conversations with the students. We've got to do some work to change mindsets. They really believe that they've been abandoned. And I'm talking predominantly about flex students. It's very difficult to actually get engagement. You get an entrenched attitude where they say, look, I'm flex for a reason. I say, I recognise that, but you've also enrolled in a course. I'm trying to meet you halfway. Are you prepared to meet me halfway? I have those sort of conversation starters at the moment. I just finished with a student a few minutes ago who Easy Connect is a red flag across 2 courses, hasn't been involved with the course, has looked at Moodle once this term. So I spoke to him about his assignment, which is due tomorrow, and talked to him, negotiated an extension, said to him, look, I want to talk to you about this course and how you can succeed. I'd like to see you succeed. You've got more fails than you have got passes. And, that's where I'm coming from. And I think while I accept and endorse everything we're saying at the moment, we have got disconnected, not just disengaged, but disconnected students who are enrolling and re-enrolling, who have got no guidance whatsoever. So whatever we can do within the map to actually, effectively churn these people so that they get re-engaged and are not disconnected, I'm all for.
There's some fantastic research on the sociology of education from Pierre Bourdieu that goes back, I think, to the 80s, where he looks at why is it that students from elite backgrounds do better at university. And a lot of the presumptions before he conducted his research was that the posh kids get more support because they have more money. And because their parents, have more money, they can spend more money on elite education, and that's why. And what Bourdieu actually found was that was only one tiny piece of the puzzle. And what was actually the biggest issue was what he calls cultural capital. And for me, that's a really fascinating area of research. And I've done work with law students on that. And that is walking the walk and talking the talk. And we need to scaffold that, and we need to scaffold that for students who transition, and particularly students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And again, the low socioeconomic background is not so much the lack of money that's usually the problem. It's more the transition to what we expect in terms of learner behaviour and what we expect. And often, because we take a course by course, unit by unit focus on programs, often that's left sort of in no man's land. And we need to be more overt about that. And that ties into the course mapping project, which is the next project down the turnpike to come along. But yeah, I hear what people are saying, that we need to be more overt about that. There needs to be less of the hidden curriculum. There needs to be less of just assuming students will figure out what to do, and more scaffolding in that. And I think part of that is developing that before, during and after model for course guides, and being able to set expectations and be able to say before class, not only here's a set of readings, but here are questions that ask specifically about what we want you to do with those readings. And a lot of students get caught up with just, I've read the readings, you know, I've processed them, nothing's sunk in, or let's not read them because we'll read them if it's relevant for assessment, or all those kinds of things, whereas we need to be more overt about why we're asking them to read them. Anyway, so it's I think something we need to, that's going to be a bigger and bigger issue for us.
Scott, can I ask you, when you're doing this research, particularly on problem solving, active learning and things, is this coming from a Western philosophy base as distinct from an Eastern culture?
There's a lot of research on particularly Chinese students, and in terms of the kinds of learning that some students are accustomed to. And I think the original idea was that the Confucian education models were more about sort of just writing down everything the teacher said and not questioning it. I'm not an expert in that field. My colleague Carolyn has worked a lot more in that field. I think we're beginning to challenge that, and we're beginning to find that that's a little bit of a pat answer. Sorry if there's any pats out there. But again, it's more about the overt curriculum. And one thing we've noticed about international students is, and some people have said, well, how come, you know, their IELTS scores are like this, but their English language skills don't seem to be at that level? Something happens between the IELTS test and the classroom, and particularly during the first term, where students disengage from the main language group, and students who have it will form into language clusters. And again, this is one thing that if we're aware of it, we can start to design around it. And if students are only talking to students in their own language, then they're not getting the language skills practice and so on, and that sort of exacerbates the problem. So yeah, there's a whole body of knowledge out there around international students and cultures of learning, and that's the sort of thing that hopefully the university centre can provide us with more resources and professional development on. But I'm conscious of their limitations as well.
It just concerns me that you say that you want them to make and defend choices and reflect on the consequences of those choices. I don't believe most of the international students, and maybe those on metro campuses can argue against us, would have that confidence in their own ability to argue, if you like, and justify in English to do those sorts of things, particularly at the first year level in international students. Then
that's something we need to start scaffolding. And we start building. I mean, one of the...
Right. In that case, marketing 11029, I've got it, turn 2. You and I will get together and you can do it from scratch. There you go.
Definitely. And it's the sort of thing that I think we need to do on a program level as well. So it's not piecemeal, that it's coherent. I mean, we're not going to win this one overnight. It's always just going to be baby steps of improvement. But if we know what the problem is, then we can start working towards it. Now, one of the problems that we have on the siloed approach of courses is everyone has a lot of stuff to get through. There's not a lot of air in the program. And if I was to say to most of us, including to myself, hey, make 30% space to put something in here which is about core academic skills, I know what most of us would say. It's like, but I've only got 11 weeks to get through. I've got all this stuff I need to get through. How am I going to find room in the course to do that? Well, that's the big challenge. That's the course level challenge. How can we open up some air in our programs where we can actually focus on those core academic skills, that cultural capital, those transitional issues, without individual course coordinators feeling as though they're somehow shortchanging students or they're having to cut material out. I know in the early days of graduate attributes that was a problem, and people were told everyone has to put a teamwork component in their units, and then every unit had a teamwork component, and people were finding that was working against what their agenda is. Now we need to find a way to actually get the ducks in a row and to make sure that we're not working against the different parts are not pulling against each other, that it's all worked into the program.
Scott, can I make a couple of comments? Just briefly, I think the second project should have been the first project. I think the mapping exercise is the most important element of this, because that will tell us in each of our particular programs what we're intending to achieve. And we've got guidance from texts from various organisations as to what those things may be. Once you know what you want to achieve, then it's a case of looking across all of the courses in your particular program, thinking about how you're going to achieve each of those elements in a sequenced, progressive manner. Then all of your different alternatives that you've set out, I think really elegantly and very well in these documents, come into play. Who's going to do what in each particular course? What content can we actually get rid of that we don't need to free up space for some of these, particularly these core skills areas you've been referring to? But I think the document that you've been discussing today is the second part of the exercise. It's good that it's out there and people can start to think about it, but this has to be done in a very coordinated and planned way, because what will happen is that we have all of these great ideas, but they're very hard to latch onto. So it needs a coordinated approach to managing a project like this. And I think it needs to be done in the discipline teams with respect to their particular programs. I mean, that's my overall view in terms of how you would manage something like this. Otherwise, we'll end up with a situation where we'll adopt bits and pieces. Different people adopt bits and pieces. People that perhaps aren't here today won't adopt any of it. And then we end up with a little bit of a mess. And we get some good subjects, we get some bad subjects, and we continue along the same path we've always done. Although a little bit more enlightened perhaps, but it doesn't actually improve that significantly the whole program. And that's the sort of thing we need to do if we're going to be competitive. We've got to have a good program and be recognised for that. And that requires a lot of planning. And it requires the discipline teams to sit down and seriously look at what they're teaching and who's doing what. So that's my 2 cents, 2 cents worth at this point, just looking at the overall topic.
Thanks, Stephen. I guess one reason to do this part of the project first was to try and get the core ethos and start talking about the ethos before we look at mapping. And that's why I've been trying to point out the whole fact that the engaged classroom model is not just about designing a Moodle site. It's not just about designing a weekly activity. It's also at the program level. The other thing about course mapping, and that's an interesting challenge, is I've just come from my previous position at Deakin was evaluating their course mapping project, which was the course evidence portfolio and course enhancement project there. Now that was, and it still is, something between a $3 and $5 million project across the university at Deakin. They've invested massive amounts of money into course mapping and course enhancement. The problem with it is that what they've produced is these portfolios of thousands and thousands and thousands of outcomes. And if you mix outcomes into different assessment tasks, you can easily get somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 distinct pieces of information out of any particular course. What the real challenge is not just engaging in that process and getting that data, but then figuring out how do you conceptualize and how do you actually measure and evaluate that kind of data. And Deakin has spent a lot of money on that and has not managed to actually crack it. I'm sure we'll be able to.
I think the problem with that approach is that, firstly, I don't think we should do that. Firstly, we don't have the money. Secondly, I don't think it's actually effective.
No.
I think it's better to sit down with your discipline teams and look at your particular course. You don't need thousands of pages of documents. You do need to have a map that outlines basically where things are going to occur and who's going to do, or which course, not who, but which courses are going to do these things at which levels. It doesn't have to become more complex than that. If we achieve that across all of our courses, we'd be a long way down the road towards much better programs than we currently have. At the moment, we're too focused, I think, on individual subjects and what's achieved in those. And the mapping will overcome that if we take it seriously. And the mapping can also include, of course, what assessments are going to occur in those subjects. Yeah.
Stephen, I agree wholeheartedly. I think in the last couple of years, we've got very caught up in mapping learning objectives based on what TEXA has decided that they want us to do, and we've forgotten about content. And we've forgotten about learning as an iteration from we teach a foundation and we apply that foundation and practice that foundation, then we assess that foundation, and then we add in more complex pieces of content. And we need to look back to our courses and say, where are we introducing, where are we advancing, where are we applying, and have a map that's very clear. Because then when we change content in one subject, we know how it's going to impact the antecedent subjects and the subjects that are consequently happening. So what we often do is we change content in isolation of the other courses, and we all end up teaching the same thing. So I think that's a very important part. I've heard about the Deakin program as well, Scott. A very dear friend of Ross's and mine works there, and it has created so much information that everyone is now extremely confused as to what they're doing. And it really should be quite a simple process, and we can start with some simple tools in each of the disciplines to get there. But I do love the engaged classroom, and I think there's a lot more we can do to create strong social bonds with our students that for our ESL students make them feel a lot more comfortable in an environment that may not be what they perceive to be a natural environment to them. We can make them feel more comfortable, but we can also engage a lot of our introverted students and our technologically older students who are a bit deficit with their technology. But well done. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Margie. Yeah, look, this is jumping ahead a little to the next project, but my conceptualization of the course mapping project is there's sort of two levels to it. One is, and it's not even really a mapping project, it's an outcome data collection and visualization process. I know that sounds like the most exciting thing anyone's ever done ever, but basically being able to get a picture of everything that we do and then being able to break down what's happening where. And I think that's one part of it. And the other part, and we'll be talking about this at the retreat next week, the other part is the much simpler conceptualized level of what is it that we're doing, what is the top level outcomes that we want to achieve. And I think they're two different but connected processes. The problem is most universities have just been focusing on the data collection, and the data collection has, as you said, it's just driving people crazy because there's too much of it, and producing simple pie charts and things doesn't necessarily really help, and people are getting burnt out with the sheer effort of doing it all as well. So more of that to come. And I certainly welcome, once we get the draft plans on the table as to how we're going to go about that mapping process, certainly welcome lots more discussion on that. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to go quickly through the chat window because we've sort of lost I've lost the thread of that a little bit. Okay, Ross, we answered that question. In terms of Moodle design, we're working with very, very limited central resources in terms of support for Moodle. My idea is that we could have like a design template that has set graphics across the courses and things like we've done with the MBA. But I think most of what we want to do with a template can be done on an individual level. And one of the biggest problems we have, and this is not a criticism of individual course coordinators, is that people are putting too much information on the main page of Moodle, and it's getting very confusing. And we need to be better at using things like Moodle books to actually move content onto its own separate page so that people can navigate around it. And those are all professional development things. I'm conscious that just telling people go to the Moodle help site and figure it out for yourself is not the solution. I'm not sure what the solution is. And we certainly as a university don't have very many central resources to help us do that. But I'm hoping that what I'm calling the Moodle design guide will get people thinking, or at least helping each other with some of those design issues as to how do we actually stop it being just a huge list of data. How can we arrange information? Dan's been contentious and talking about portfolios. I think portfolios are definitely part of the picture, as is digital badging. These are new tools that give us ways of engaging with students across different units of study, across different courses. And I think those will be part of the big picture. If students feel as though they are building a coherent portfolio of evidence of their skills throughout the 3 years of their program, that gives them more buy-in, and that gives them a way of structuring things that the siloed approach doesn't do. I mean, it's a bigger issue than we can discuss in an hour today, but I think that the use of portfolios supported by badging may well provide a way of connecting things that currently the curriculum doesn't let us do.
Scott, worth underlining again your earlier point that the assessment's got to be reasonably less labour intensive.
Yeah.
Last year we talked a lot about moving away from very labour intensive, over-assessing courses. So I don't know what work's involved with portfolios, but I'd prefer it wasn't labour intensive.
Yeah.
A lot of staff complain about huge workloads. Some of these are self-imposed. If we're going to boost our research performance, we don't need to devote all our life to marking. So we're going to find that happy medium somewhere in that realm.
And part of that's a design thing too. It's not adding more on the top. It's actually thinking about what are some of the things we're actually getting students to do now that can actually turn into an artifact that goes into a portfolio. And again, what we talked about before in terms of core study skills, the portfolio has to be for the students part of their core foundation curriculum into how to use it. It also has to be part of our core PD in terms of making sure all our staff are confident with using it. Again, at Deakin, I was involved in one of the e-portfolio projects, which stalled because the individual lecturers at the coalface didn't know what was going on, and basically were told, by the way, you have to put portfolios into your courses, and they weren't very happy about it, and basically just treated it with about as much respect as they were treated when they were told that they had to put portfolios in. So we have to be very careful of how we do it. But again, it's about redirecting effort. And rather than spending all our time focusing on labour-intensive marking, let's look at some of the peer evaluation alternatives. Let's look at University of New South Wales, I believe. Everyone was told they had to reduce their marking time by 25% across every unit. It's a huge project for them. But they had to come up with some really interesting solutions to how to do that. Okay.
Sorry, just one more comment about assessment, Lee. That apart from the aspect of having peer assessment, which I support, is the notion that you may design assessment whereby, for example, students who do particular items of assessment can get up to, say, a pass or a credit level standard. Those who want to actually go beyond that do additional items of assessment. So you may actually move away from the model of everybody doing the same assessment. And I've seen that in practice in some of the disciplines at UQ. Not in business and law, I don't think, but certainly in engineering I've seen that happening. And that, I don't know whether that's even possible under our existing assessment policy, and that's something we need to have a look at, I think. But there are other models of assessment. So in terms of the overall amount of assessment, not everybody actually wants to do the extra work to get the higher levels of performance in terms of a high distinction. Yeah. So there's different models.
Yeah, we'll discuss it later, Stephen, but I thought we went down that road last year and we were told no, that we had to have standard assessment for everyone.
Yeah, I think we need to take that, have a closer look at that.
Okay.
Because it's another way.
Can I just add something to that conversation, Lee and Stephen? I'm actually enrolled in an undergrad course at CQ at the moment, and it's a psych course, and they have an assessment item where there are basically 6 pieces of assessment. You can do the minimum of 3, or you can do the whole lot. So you get it's worth 40%, or say 40%. So you can do the minimum of 3, and all you're going to get is whatever you get out of 30, and you're actually just giving away 10%. You can do 4, and say you can maximise your chances, or you can do all of them, and then the best 4 get put into the grade book. That I presume would give students the opportunity to make a decision as to how much work they want to put into the course.
And I think, a couple of things. One is that staff are spending a lot of their time. We don't want to run the risk of stigmatising and labelling students at the beginning, but we spend a lot of our time dragging students into doing things that a lot of them will just refuse to engage in. And there's a lot of energy wasted on students who've already decided that they're going to do the bare minimum to get through. The other thing is some research from Scandinavia is showing that the students who are most at risk of disengagement are the credit level students, and particularly the credit level students who could be distinction level students. Because the high distinction and distinction students are already getting on and doing their own thing. They don't really care what we do in the classroom because they're already onto it, and they basically ignore what we do, and they do very well, generally speaking. We spend a lot of our time trying to drag those fails over the line, or trying to make sure that the fails that we've got who have appealed don't go over the line because they don't deserve to. And there's this whole body of students sitting around a credit who are basically saying, well, what about me? I'm sitting in a classroom. The obvious example is, in the middle of a lecture, when the student in the front row says, can you go over the last 10 slides again? And if you do that because you're worried about your fail rates, then the rest of the room, all the students go, oh, not again. So it's very difficult to be definitive about this stuff, and there's a real danger that you start stigmatising some of those difficult students and saying, look, you're in that category. But the losers in that situation are often the students who are the could-be students, because they're not doing badly enough that they're coming up on the radar, they're not doing well enough that they're doing well, and they tend to get ignored in the middle. So, yeah, I'm really open to thinking about some of these solutions in terms of allowing students to self-select to a certain extent. Another tool we have in the repertoire is digital badging, because we can be in a situation where we can actually badge additional achievement. And those are things that go into students' portfolios, they go into CVs. And let's face it, at the end of the day, when they come to a job interview, it's these distinctive achievements are things they can talk about in an interview, whereas grade point averages is just what your grade point average is. Anyway, a note from Jim about ethos and core values, and I will certainly, that's going to be one of the focuses of our retreat. I know Margie's done some excellent work in that area, so I look forward to the discussion we'll be having at the retreat in terms of our values, ethos and beliefs. In terms of the engaged classroom, I'm putting it out there to see if that matches our ethos. I've cherry-picked what I think, what Carolyn and I have thought are the best features of the different models that are floating around, those that are the smartest, those that are easiest for us to implement without going crazy, and those that seem to be working. But if this is going to work, it has to be something that we own as a community. It has to be something that people say, yeah, this is what we believe in. And if there's parts of it people are saying, oh, this is part of some dodgy sort of sinister secret agenda here going on here, yeah, let's talk about it, because there aren't actually any of those secret agendas, but we need to have those sorts of conversations. Okay, I'm conscious of the time. We are running out of meeting time, and people have other things they need to be going off to. I think Lee has some final comments.
I don't make them final comments. I've drifted in and out of the conversation, so forgive me if I'm going back. The real issue with the engaged classroom for me and international students is that Hillary is still not on side with this whole thing about engaged classrooms. She still believes the ESOS Act is about face-to-face instruction. So we've got to be very careful how we manoeuvre this into the international campuses. However, at the same time, I was trying to point out in one of my posts that we're building our domestic numbers, and I don't want us to be blinkered by the fact we have international students. I'd like to think that in 3 years' time, we've pushed the domestic numbers so they're at least 50-50, such as on the Brisbane campus. But I just think we need to be sensitive that Hillary ain't going to be on side unless we do a lot of good work around making sure that the engaged classroom equates her view of the ESOS Act.
And in fact, one of the reasons we didn't, there's been a bit of the term flipped classroom has a pretty bad reputation around CQU, and I think some people have done it very poorly. And they've said, we flipped the classroom, and basically they've just produced a whole lot of online lectures and have taken sort of classroom support away from students. So one of the reasons why we used the different term, and I believe Stephen actually came up with the term, so thank you, Stephen, because it's a really good one, was so that we didn't hit those sorts of roadblocks. But yeah, the reason I put a page on workload and delivery models to separate it out was just to flag that we shouldn't, while we want this model to support innovation and to support those new models, we have to be very careful as how we deploy them, particularly with international students. So we need to make sure we don't, without checking, say, hey, we're now all going all virtual and we're doing all these things and doing things which may start, raising concerns at high levels. We need to make sure we do it in a coherent way, but also in an innovative and creative way. So easy. We can do that before lunchtime, I'm sure. Alrighty. Well,
I was just going to say, Scott, it's interesting that we require to meet the ESOS Act, and yet we're not enforcing attendance at class for international students. I'm getting all my lecturers to send me class attendance every week, and I'm absolutely appalled at the lack of attendance.
All the ESOS Act says is not distance. So there's this whole continuum between something that's distance and something that's not distance. And
isn't there a requirement for attendance? Isn't there a requirement for 80% attendance?
There's a requirement that I think 75% of subjects are not distance subjects.
Yeah, no, but I'm talking about distance. I'm talking about if we're not to use the flipped classroom, that means we've got to do face-to-face stand and deliver. But what's the point of doing that if the students aren't coming to class?
Well, that's where we need to start building those that cultural capital into the students. And again, it's driven through assessment, and it's driven through doing things that are in class, that are assessed, that are valuable, that are not driving us crazy with our workload. So one example of that is reflective work, where students reflect on their learning experiences. They keep a learning journal. They submit a part of the learning journal for assessment. That's one option among many.
Yeah, I used to do that elsewhere, and it's very successful. But you've got to have lecturers and tutors that actually sign up to the program and are willing to push it. It's a team effort, and it's very hard to get that going with our distributed model.
Yeah, and that's
the irony is, from a marketing point of view, that although international students may not come to class, they don't see the value in only having to come to campus 1 or 2 hours per course. So Alsa Lamont and her folks will say that they see it as a value proposition. Why am I paying to come to university when there is no contact with the university?
Yeah, I think people having their cake and eating it too is part of the whole problem. And when we certainly know that from student surveys and things, that they'll say, I didn't get enough feedback, but these are the same students who don't come to class. And you're like, well, where do you think you're going to get your feedback from? Are we going to go around individually to your home and give you personalised feedback?
So let's just pick up Dan's point. Dan made a comment there that students need a reason to come to class. This is exactly what we've been arguing for the last 6 months.
Yep.
Interesting enough, when I go to all the international campuses, everyone does want to hear it, but the Student Barometer survey was pretty clear now for 5 years about the same things. Poor quality teaching, reading PowerPoint slides, no feedback on assignments. Why would a student come if all we do is read what we're already posted on the website? Where's the value add in what we're doing? Where's the real tangible benefits from being in a tute? They're the things we've got to go back to that we've forgotten about for some reason. Not everyone, but a good chunk.
And informal feedback as well. I mean, the thing about the science lab practicums is, if you're about to set yourself on fire with a Bunsen burner, someone in the classroom, whether it be the tutor or a peer, will say, hey, you're about to set yourself on fire with a Bunsen burner. Don't do that. We don't have those kinds of informal feedback opportunities either. Quite often, I don't want to generalise because some people are doing really good things in that space, but we need to think about those aspects as well.
Yeah. So maybe to go back to where some of the discussion went before, I think Stephen was arguing that the first step is to actually get the course mapping done, because the course mapping then highlights the assessment issues we need to tackle. And then the engaged classroom is really a vehicle to address how we do the assessment in part, or the design of the teaching.
Yep. Yep. And there's the two, as I said, there's the two stages to the course mapping. One, which is what is commonly called course mapping, which is just data collection and data visualization. So we need to know what it is we're currently doing. And then there's the design level of it, where we need to be able to say, what is it we want to do? Because otherwise you end up in the Deakin situation where you have thousands of pieces of information and no way of knowing, well, is this good or is this bad? You know, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that the important thing here is that we build this into a quality system. Part of going for the Amber accreditation is that we have to demonstrate that everything we do has a rationale and a quality process that's behind it. It's probably too strong to talk about it, Ross, in ISO 9000 standards. But the reason we've brought Sue Christensen into the school now is that that's exactly what I want to happen. We've got to have a robust way of doing everything in the school. I guess what I've tried to do in the last year and a half now since I took over is that we have to build these models. We have to build these processes. We've been a school that's been aimlessly floating around from one thing to another without latching onto something and saying, this is what we will do. If I haven't made it clear in my forum a few weeks ago, this is what we will do. We have to be a quality school. We do that by being very clear what's in our programs, how we assess it, and the rest of that. So I don't want to take over the meeting, but, you know, the need to do the course mapping appropriately, if that's the right word, is paramount to this.
And the end part of that is the peer review process. So the course mapping has to end at some point, and I don't want to be the one who says this is the process, everyone has to do it, because I think that's where the discipline group's role is in generating those options. But we need a process, again, using the Deakin example. Everyone has these huge volumes of their data, but they don't necessarily have processes to say, what do we do with it? And people are just saying, well, okay, fine. We've got 25% of our courses have teamwork in them. Should it be 30%? Should it be 10%? You know? Sorry, I cut someone off there.
I just had an observation, and that is with the mapping exercise, I don't hear anything being said about a conduit or a mechanism for feeding back our successes, because nothing succeeds like successes. I keep telling my students. So you know, we need to have some feedback mechanism built into the system, or into the mapping process, so that we can actually say, right, this is hitting above the watermark. This is exactly what we're after. Let's see more of it. You know.
I think that's why the course mapping process is so depressing for so many people, is that quite often it is just about what things are missing and things that need fixing. And I'm certainly taking that into account, because I think once people start getting into that compliance mindset, partially it's because they don't see the point of it, and partially it's because people are afraid that the process is just there to show up things that they've done wrong so they can be kicked around for them. So yeah, definitely one of the things at that higher level, I was talking about the data collection level, and there's the sort of aspirational level, is saying, well, what is it that we want to be good at? What is it that we want students 10 years from graduation to come back to us and to say, you know what was really good about my degree? It was this. So what is the this?
Maybe not 10 years, maybe 3 years. But we do need to have some way of endorsing these things, because otherwise people just build defence routines.
Yeah.
Just to defend Deakin a little bit, the MBA degree at Deakin undertook its own mapping exercise where we got all the subject coordinators together, and they sat around a table and talked about the learning outcomes, the graduate learning outcomes, the course learning outcomes, and then put a matrix together that said, this is where we're going to focus on each of these subjects.
Yeah.
And it worked really well, very collaboratively, and it worked extremely well. Once the learning development unit took it on to all the other courses, that's when the massive problem with documentation came about. If you focus on a program level, then you can do it really effectively.
Yeah.
One of the problems with using discipline-based is you've got multiple programs, and that's when you run into problems. So I think it might be easier to start thinking about the programs individually and mapping the exercises around the various courses in each program.
That's probably true. Yeah. because I'm sort of my course and discipline are my program and discipline are the same area, so it's very easy for me to see that. But yeah, you're quite right. The program is probably the correct juncture to start thinking about these issues. And yes, definitely. I didn't want to sound like I'm slagging off Deakin too much. I was working for the centre. I was working for the organisation that was spending the $3 to $5 million a year. And one thing we heard from the schools was, how come we don't have the money to do this for ourselves? How come people from the centre are coming in all the time and telling us what to do? One advantage of not having any money is that we do have to do it for ourselves, and no one else is getting paid money to do it in a way that we don't agree with, I guess. Anyway, I'm conscious that we've gone a little over time and people have places to go and things to do. Thank you all so much for coming along and contributing. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep the channels open, and definitely looking forward to hearing feedback from you all. Okay.